Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, The Dynamic Supply Chain. We're excited to talk with you today. Before diving in, a few quick housekeeping items. Today's presentation is being recorded, and the recording will be available on pointb.com later this week. Also, if you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the Q&A pod. And with that, let's get started. I'd like to begin by having my two colleagues who are joining me this morning to introduce themselves. Veronica.
Hi, I'm Veronica Grace. I have almost 25 years of experience working as an engineer in operations management and in consulting, in manufacturing and supply chain. I work across a variety of industries, including life sciences. Steve?
Thanks, Veronica. Hello, my name is Steve Moscow. My career started in high-tech manufacturing, and it's continued in industry and consulting to focus mostly on life sciences, particularly life sciences operations. Over the last decade, I've focused more on biologics and more recently on cell and gene therapy, most recently on autologous personalized medicine, manufacturing, and supply chains. Pat?
And I'm Pat Edmonds. I have 30 years of operations and supply chain experience across multiple industries, including pharma and medical device manufacturers. I've held multiple executive operations roles, including building out and operating supply chains, and I've led the transformation approach for multiple large and small company supply chains. And then finally, I founded Point B's operations and supply chain consulting practice when I joined the firm 11 years ago. So next slide, please. And what may be the understatement of the year, it's safe to say that most pharmaceutical supply chains are happy to see the last couple of years in the rearview mirror. Shocks from events like trade wars, global health crises, and increasing regulatory pressures have sent biotech supply chain leaders reeling with unprecedented shortages in labor, supplies, and logistical capacity. And unfortunately, we're not out of the woods yet. Of course, the real concern these supply chain challenges present extends far beyond the implications to our business. The patients and families of people who desperately need these life-improving and life-saving treatments have the most to lose if we don't find answers soon. Veronica?
So across the work that we've done, we have found several themes in this problem space. The first is that we are unconnected. We know that successful organizations are highly effective in reacting to the needs of their customers. And when we cannot connect those customer needs to our operational decisions, we can't make decisions that are both robust and timely. We need line of sight to all of the data. Where we can make effective decisions, if we can't connect those decisions to our operations and effect real change, we're not successful. In some industries, this delay of information and operational change can result in postponed sales. But as we know in life sciences, this delay can have a much bigger impact. We see very real patient impacts. And from a commercial lens, in some cases, we may miss a window to commercialize a product at all. We also know that we are fragile. We see that we know that over 80% of our active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China, India, and just a handful of other countries. And just that's one example of where our foundation of our pharma supply chain is weak. We know that any disruption within any of these countries or between what is sometimes single source or single manufacturer can halt production worldwide. We saw this play out during the pandemic when India imposed an export ban, and it's just one example of our fragile supply chain. We also know that we're inefficient. We consistently see reaction rather than proactive improvement efforts. We saw during the pandemic attempts to free ICU capacity. In some cases, this was done by shortening patient length of stay. The downstream impact was actually higher bounce back or readmission to the ICU. So our attempts to increase capacity actually increased demand, which is not efficient, nor is it effective. But we are forced to react in these cases. We also see that we are static. We are always operating with limited information. Every organization is. But we need enough information to support scenario planning across both the short term, the long term, across demand, across supply, and we need to be able to look at multiple scenarios. We also need to isolate our critical variables. We need to be able to pull those operational levers in a dynamic way to enact change. It's not enough, for example, to increase our medical supplies if we don't also have the ability to increase our resources. So these are big challenges, and the solutions are not easy, but it's not going away. This is not just a function of the pandemic. The pandemic merely exacerbated existing problems in our supply chain. And we think that these opportunities are also game-changing, competitive advantage opportunities that will take work and a focused approach. Pat, I'm going to pass it back to you to talk more about our perspective.
And next slide, please. Despite these challenges, pharma supply chains are capable of not only surviving, but even thriving in the new normal of the 21st century. So Point B works extensively with life sciences companies in all segments, sizes, and stages of maturity. And after studying these pharma supply chains that have been best positioned to survive and even thrive during these challenging times, we've identified a model that we call the dynamic supply chain that describes the path pharma supply chains really should follow to be in a position to succeed. And specifically, we define the dynamic supply chain as balancing 4 critical capabilities. They must be first connected, which means they're able to maintain visibility and integration throughout the end-to-end value chain. They must be resilient, so able to withstand shocks and even capitalize rapidly on emerging opportunities. They must be scalable, which means able to grow in terms of market share and life cycle maturity for their products. And finally, they must be value-based. So that means that they're able to use process and technology to sustainably maximize return on limited time and assets. There's clearly a tremendous amount we could share around each of these 4 capabilities, far more than we have time to drill into today in this brief presentation, but we want to dive in a little bit deeper into these 4 capabilities to introduce our point of view. And so I'll start with Steve explaining the connectedness capability.
Thanks, Pat. Next slide. For the connected supply chain, we have to be efficient, scalable, resilient, and compliant. And the life sciences companies must build a robust information management architecture to be able to gather insights from a flood of data. So let's take an example. Let's imagine that there's severe weather, which has delayed a shipment of a reagent needed for QC testing in a manufacturing facility. The supply chain control tower has identified that risk and has also identified an emergency source if the projected arrival date of the reagent exceeds the safety margin for this temperature-controlled item. However, the shipment arrives at the dock in time, it's automatically inspected and accepted by the condition sensors. The pallet is robotically directed to the GMP warehouse, and then it's immediately taken to the QC lab while the receipt is matched to the order for payment. This chain of events is enabled by a web of communications and analytics that operates across different technologies and even crosses organizational boundaries. Likewise, the increasing importance of cell and gene therapy products is extending the supply chain all the way back to the individual patient. This patient is often both a supplier of the autologous cellular or genetic material and is also a customer of the drug product. The end-to-end supply chain, from the blood or the tissue collection to the therapy administration, must be completely controlled and it must be tightly orchestrated. In this case, the production planning and logistics must interface with the patient and also with the manufacturing facility scheduling system, starting all the way back at the treatment planning phase. The key to a connected supply chain is to start with the data underlying the critical functions and to build modular solutions that share the same core cloud platforms. Building modular, upgradable solutions speeds up the value realization while also allowing you to build new capabilities iteratively. What's the takeaway? Build for the supply chain of the future rather than propping up the past supply chain processes. Back to you, Pat.
Thanks, Steve. Next slide, please. The second capability of the dynamic supply chain is resiliency. And we define resiliency as the ability to prevent or limit a shock from impacting our performance and the capacity to recover quickly from some type of shock if it occurs. A shock is any type of event that occurs outside of normal supply chain operations that poses a potential threat to performance, quality, and sustainability. And we think about shocks taking many different forms. For example, shocks could be from a weather event, like a hurricane. They could be from an economic event, like a trade barrier or a recession. You can think about shocks as having stemming from a labor impact, like a strike or an unexpected departure of a key person in your organization, or an epidemic, or geopolitical events like a war. And you can describe the effect of a shock on a supply chain as manifesting in 3 dimensions, as you can see on the chart there. The first is probability, and probability is the likelihood that performance will be degraded if a shock occurs, leading to the question, how prepared is your supply chain? The second dimension is impact, which is the degree of significance of performance degradation incurred by a shock, which leads to the natural question, how ready is your supply chain? And then finally, duration is the length of time required to resume pre-shock performance, leading to the question, how adaptable is your supply chain? So given that definition of shock and the impacts of that, your resiliency then is determined by your ability to prevent or mitigate the damage that a shock will incur on your supply chain by addressing the combination of these 3 dimensions of a shock. And so you have 3 levers you can build your resiliency program around. First, should a shock occur, preparation reduces the probability that the shock will incur meaningful performance degradation on the supply chain. Ultimately, good preparation results in longer intervals between shock events that impact the organization. Think of preparation as the proactive investment in real options that help alert us of leading indicators of a shock far enough in advance that we can invoke the right defensive measures that will hopefully prevent the shock from impacting us at all. This reflects the old saying that the best time to patch your roof is when the sun is shining. The most prepared farmers we've seen invest in a combination of preparedness techniques like multi-sourcing and supplier and vendor diversity, documented standard work, and increased visibility into material market conditions. For example, one of our life sciences clients has invested in incorporating custom research and predictive analytics into their S&OP process to maximize awareness and understanding of potential leading indicators of over-the-horizon supply chain shocks. The second resiliency lever we have is readiness, and readiness impacts resiliency by minimizing the depth of the impact that a supply chain will experience should a shock occur. So think of readiness as the reactive levers you can control now during a crisis to mitigate your damage to your operations. Steve, you have an example about readiness with pipettes.
Yes, Pat. Pipettes are used frequently in testing of materials, as well as in manufacturing and in laboratories. And a lot of people had never even heard of pipettes before they hit the news, but there was a worldwide shortage driven by the pandemic and the need for additional testing. Some of our life sciences companies actually did suffer from issues on pipettes related to testing, but many of them recognized that they needed to build a stockpile because they have very high value products that they're producing, and they didn't want to have very low value items prevent them from being able to produce manufactured products or participate in testing or QC activities. So many of them prepared in advance, even without knowing that the pandemic was coming. So that is truly a resilient supply chain. Back to you, Pat.
Great, thanks. So common techniques that farmers use to enhance their readiness can include some combination of stockpiling and spares management for critical or at-risk inventories, like Steve's example, creating supplier inventory agreements, like vendor managed inventory and consignment, and investment in better inventory buffer management. And then the third lever of resiliency that you have to put your resiliency strategy together is adaptability. And adaptability describes our capability to reduce the duration of time that it takes us to resume operational performance at pre-shock levels. In recent years, we've observed some farmers use a combination of adaptability techniques like exceptions-based management through sound measurement and co-investing in the capabilities of their own suppliers, investment in a flexibly skilled workforce through cross-training, and clear succession planning. So for example, one of our larger biopharma clients has invested in building out a top-down enterprise management strategy with an executive level scorecard that cascades down through each level of the organization, down to the frontline level teams in the company. This has enabled tight alignment and line of sight with the organization's strategic priorities at all levels, nimble exceptions-based management by focusing on what's most important, and rapid root cause analysis when an out of tolerance situation arises. As with any strategy, creating a successful resiliency strategy requires balancing a number of priorities and even making some deliberate trade-offs. Ultimately, resilience is often viewed in terms of net cost avoidance and improved patient outcomes through sustained operations during crises. I'll hand it back to Veronica to explain the value-based capability of the dynamic supply chain.
Great, thanks, Pat. So for those of us who live and breathe supply chain, we have been living in a world of lean and just in time for years and years, decades even for some of us. And we've been thinking about supply chains as cost centers. We've been squeezing these functions for savings. And these are complex operations with limited visibility. As Steve alluded to earlier, the network of information and data strung across multiple systems, applications, vendors, etc. It makes efficiency gains very hard to find. But what we see in the very best supply chains is actually a demonstration of real value add and strategic advantage through that. For example, we see some supply chain operators continually finding opportunities to reallocate their capacity. And that includes labor, it includes warehouse space, it includes the way they use their third-party logistics partners. And they move toward higher value-added purpose. They leverage automation, process optimization, and in some cases, selective outsourcing. Through that, we see shifts in time and resources from non-value or low-value work to high-value add activities. We see better utilization of knowledgeable resources, very knowledgeable resources, to strategically partner with internal business functions and to continually improve and find space for innovation in their process. We see some supply chain operators actually become revenue generators by optimizing their warehouse space. In some cases, for example, contracting some of their storage capacity. So actually receiving income from that and using logistical support and consulting services as a value add. So the ability to shift our supply chain from a cost center that needs to be squeezed into an actual value add or even competitive advantage is very real. I'm going to pass it back to Steve to talk about the scalable dimension of our dynamic supply chain model.
Thanks, Veronica. So we often think of small pre-commercial life sciences companies and big pharma multinationals as being very different in their supply chain needs. But surprisingly, the challenges for a new product launch are about the same, or at least very similar for each organization. What's also similar are the inflection points and how to scale to meet the needs, including preclinical and development stages. The focus at this point is on supporting the transition from lab research to pilot manufacturing. Around the time of phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, at this point, the focus is on the ramp up of the clinical and the manufacturing supply chain to support positive clinical findings and prepare for commercialization. Then we arrive at the post-launch stage. The primary need there is on matching the supply with the demand through integrated business planning and commercial build out. And then finally, we have market expansion, globally or regionally. We're planning market access and network expansion needs to be matched with building internal and external supply capacity. There's no simple answer, but there's a path to the right solution for each organization. Company strategy and the types of intellectual capabilities help drive the decisions. For instance, is technology transfer the key to holding on to a competitive advantage? Or is controlled release of the capabilities to partners the key to rapidly building market share? Are CDMOs and leveraged supply chains the answer to a long-term scale? Or is it a way to keep the competition from beating you to the launch of a similar product? The answer is, as with many things, is it depends, but Point B can help you figure out the best path for your supply chain. While the size of the organization impacts the solution, oftentimes agility is more important than absolute size. So now back to Veronica to wrap up the discussion.
So the challenge is large. How much effort should we put toward the solution? Let's consider real life outcomes from today's supply chain. A 45-year-old woman arrives at the hospital for her cancer treatment. She's exhausted physically, emotionally. She's told her treatment isn't available. She's somebody we know. She's our friend, our sister, a mother, maybe a work colleague. Commercial impact aside, it feels like tomorrow's life sciences supply chain needs to be better than today's. The old supply chain playbooks are no longer relevant. And organizations that thrive in this new normal are reshaping their supply chains to be dynamic, connected, resilient, scalable, and value-based. Now let's open to questions. Give me just one moment while we open up some of the questions that have come in. So the first question we've received, the pandemic has caused lots of supply chain issues in a number of industries. What kind of challenges have you seen with your clients, and how have they adapted to supply chain shocks?
Let's see, I've got some comments on that one. We've seen a number of supply chain issues around raw materials that are coming from, not surprisingly, other countries. So just as a for instance, stainless steel has been a component around things that are required for building out manufacturing facilities, laboratories, and that sort of thing. So the raw materials might be coming from offshore, but then the product is domestically created. Say it's something related to racks or particular kinds of equipment in a manufacturing facility. So we've seen our customers have to become a lot more nimble in what they're going to do, particularly if it's time-sensitive delivery on a material or a piece of equipment, that they'll go for alternative sources. Sometimes that causes challenges with commissioning, qualifying, and validating the equipment. So they just have to be really flexible, sort of think out of the box. Pat, any thoughts on that?
I would just add that even beyond basic pharma supplies, if you kind of take a broader view, a lot of our clients are thinking about expanding in these times. And so when you think about kind of the broader supply chain of facilities, for example, building out a larger geographical footprint, right? You want to open a new warehouse, for example, which we've seen. Other types of expansion or physical footprint expansion. The supply chain is difficult there too, right? The materials are expensive, which is causing it to be a more expensive proposition than I think a lot of original business cases have predicted and were based on. In addition, I think even beyond like construction and facilities management, if you're thinking about expanding, just transportation, just standard 3PL concerns, third-party logistics concerns, has become tougher and tougher, right? We've seen the challenges of freight. We've seen the challenges of logistics supply chain, right? The services of a supply chain that are also being challenged as well. And while infrastructure continues to be built in the 3PL community to try to build up capacity, those challenges look like they're going to be with us for some time.
One thing I might add to that question is we are seeing consistently across all of our clients a doubling down on talent, retention, employee happiness, really focusing on retaining the top talent that they have and finding novel ways to attract new talent, and particularly in these supply chain operation areas. I'll move to the next question. What kind of impacts have you seen on clinical trial supply chains?
Veronica, I'm going to interpret that as being related to the pandemic in particular, and reflecting on that. One is that in the very beginning, clinical trials were impacted for any starts of new clinical trials because folks didn't want to go into the clinical trial management sites, hospitals, clinics, that sort of thing. And so it really forced the clinical trial managers to think about different ways of delivering the clinical trials, and moving maybe a little quicker to decentralized clinical trial management as opposed to the more traditional model of central sites. So one of the things that affected them initially was just the logistics. So rather than having a store of clinical trial materials at the central site, they had to figure out how to distribute those out to clinics and providers that could participate in the clinical trial in a decentralized fashion. So just logistics was something that the supply chains had to think about. And then later on, as we hinted earlier, things like pipettes and other testing supplies became in a little bit more short supply. So they had to be oftentimes those things that you would have taken for granted at central locations needed to also be shipped out to decentralized locations for management of the clinical trial. Pat or Veronica, any other thoughts on that?
Well, maybe just to put a fine point on your last point there, Steve. We've seen with some of our clients, actually them having to make some pretty hard choices about if they've got multiple clinical trials going on, right? Different products that are in that stage. When you've got the same base ingredients or supplies that you're relying on for both of those, needing to change timelines accordingly. You really wind up in sort of the Sophie's choice kind of situation sometimes, to the point that we've seen some products actually really be put in jeopardy in terms of their original timelines, because the supply chains are not delivering all of the components, those critical components that are needed.
I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. The next one is around data breach. Have data breaches been top of mind for the clients you work with? Any thoughts on that?
Pat, I know that we've had concern about that a little earlier on in the process. It would affect the supply chain, but there's been a concern about data breaches. Oftentimes, as I hinted earlier, we're working with clients that are in the autologous medicine. So there's a really high bar on chain of identity and chain of custody on those products. So there's a lot of sensitivity around the data about the patient on those. Other thoughts, Pat?
Yeah, I would say that specifically to data breaches recently, it's been mixed. I think for some of our clients, the number one, number two, number three focuses is all about bringing supply availability. It's sort of an existential concern, but for organizations that maybe are not quite at that tipping point, data breaches have got to be key. And I would kind of open this question up, which is a good one, even more broadly into not just data breaches, not just the kind of protection against these reactive threats, but increased jurisdictional readiness, right? As you think about expanding your footprint into the EU, for example, or into Asia beyond North America, jurisdictional readiness for your supply chain is something that I think historically has been underestimated and usually looked at as a last minute thing. And when you look at things like privacy requirements, evolving privacy requirements, and other types of data restrictions, even beyond, again, those reactive data breach type of concerns, You have to be thinking about your whole organization, not just your supply chain, but including your supply chain in terms of, are you actually ready and to be compliant, right, with basic requirements across multiple jurisdictions.
We are actually at time, and I regret that we did not have a chance to get through all of the questions, but would love to follow up with any of those initiators separately. I'll pass it to you, Steve, for a quick wrap up.
Yes, we just want to thank you for joining us today. In the next day or two, we'll email a link to the recorded presentation. If there's anything you'd like to review, or if you'd like to share it with colleagues. You can also reach out to us at insights@pointb.com if you have any questions. We'll also try to get back to you for some of the questions that we see in the Q&A that we did not get to in the limited time that we had for the webinar today. Again, want to thank you for your participation today, and we look forward to speaking with you again in the near future. Take care.